In 2007, I was conducting a research project on learning materials for people studying English as a second language. I sought to find the impact of resources that featured only majority groups, for example, white men speaking standard American English. I found that learners were, in fact, more willing to communicate with people whose version of English they already had exposure to and were comfortable with. Those learners were more reluctant to interact with people whose variety or dialect of English differed from what they had learned. Some students even cited fear and avoidance of English speakers with more marked dialects. This is an example of how lack of exposure perpetuates bias. We tend to have greater confidence communicating with people when we have a relatively good idea that we'll succeed at being understood. If we're concerned about using the wrong terminology for a person, we might be less likely to engage with them at all. So, for example, if we don't know the appropriate terminology for a person's race, condition, or gender, we may just avoid interacting with them. But if our ultimate aim is to create better and more inclusive workplaces, we've got to be comfortable communicating with everyone about everything, no matter how sensitive the topic. Let's use a personal life example. Let's say that I'm having a party and know that my 100-year-old house presents accessibility challenges for people who use mobility devices, but I feel awkward even having a conversation with people who would be impacted about my space because I might feel ignorant or embarrassed. As a result, I may skip that consideration entirely and not invite any guests who would benefit from space modifications. Now, what if that happened in a work setting? What if company leadership knew that they needed to make their space more accessible, but they had so much fear about fumbling the conversation that they avoided the effort entirely? What we're fearful of is getting called out. That's a term used to describe when someone is publicly shamed for wrongdoing. In the era where so many people have video cameras on their phones, along with ready access to social media, millions of people have platforms to hold others accountable for their words and actions. Many would say that publicly calling out abusers in these cases was the only way to effectively stop the perpetrators and alert the public of these dangerous individuals and systems. Calling out these folks was leveraged when all other options demonstrably failed. Let's go back to the accessibility example. If we fumble a word or two, but our intention is actually to make the space more inclusive, is that something we should be so fearful of getting called out for doing imperfectly that we don't embark on the effort at all? This is where activist Loretta Ross says we need to show some grace towards ourselves and others who are in the early days of equity work and understand that we won't always get the words right from the start. But we shouldn't let fear of getting called out get in our way. Instead, we should practice calling in, which is where we include people in conversations and are allowed to make some mistakes along the way. If our ultimate goal is to create a more inclusive society, we can't limit social justice work only to the people who already have the right vocabulary. We need everyone to join in on this effort, especially the people who aren't versed in social justice vocabulary. What would it look like if we invited everyone to weigh in on making our spaces more inclusive? Calling people in is the fastest way we can increase everyone's exposure to people who are unlike them. That exposure results in less bias, and the less bias we have, the less likely we are to stumble into inaccurate or hurtful language. Calling in is the antidote to calling out. This is when we engage and include people in conversations without humiliation and shaming. Ross emphasizes the importance of empathy, curiosity, and forgiveness when connecting with people and having real conversations about harm. Rather than a focus on perfection, she encourages us to focus on growth and humility. Calling people into conversations about language when they get it wrong helps to reduce fear and stigma of future conversations. We're effectively making it safer to engage in equity work by not requiring perfection at each step. I encourage you to have a couple phrases ready so you can call your friends and family into conversations on language. A simple one I use when a friend uses an outdated term is, "I think you meant to say," or "the term we're using these days is." This tends to kick off a fun conversation about the origin of a particular word or why there's a better term for something. As a linguistics nerd myself, I'm obviously thrilled to have conversations about words. Also, I appreciate when people inform me of a term that is no longer being used, because obviously I don't want to be running around saying something that could hurt someone. When someone calls me in to use a term appropriately, I say, "Thanks for telling me about that." If I use the wrong pronoun for someone or pronounce their name incorrectly, I'll fix it and move on. Rather than apologizing and centering myself as the victim, I demonstrate my sincerity by getting it right the next time.